Good evening, everybody. There's nothing like parachuting yourself into a talk. So I just wanted to welcome all of you here to Jesus College, to the Digital Hub. It is my privilege as Principal Nigel Shabolt here to introduce tonight's talk. Also, I've got the particular privilege of being a senior distinguished scientist at the Institute. That's a wonderful role. But this is a talk that I have been anticipating for some time. And it's a great pleasure to hand over now to the Institute's director, Edward Harcourt, to introduce our speaker tonight. You are most welcome here. The entire concept around this space was to convene physically to debate mighty matters in the digital realm. And I can't think of a better speaker or a better set of topics than we've got tonight. So please join me in welcoming Edward Harcourt, Director of the Institute.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and a warm welcome to you from me as well to this Expert Insights seminar. I wasn't expecting a round of applause, more than I deserve. My role is to say what a great pleasure it is to have with us this evening our guest speaker, Peter Danenberg. Peter is Senior Software Engineer at Google DeepMind, where he's been since 2021, and where he plays a key role in the company's groundbreaking Gemini artificial intelligence project, which could be described as an LLM that aspires to be self-critiquing. Also at Google, he holds weekly workshops or salons that attract hundreds of attenders, which contribute to knowledge sharing and a culture of collaboration at Google. I won't recite the rest of his CV because we agreed that I wouldn't, but it's very distinguished. He speaks a number of languages, including Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Sanskrit, many of which he taught himself. He's mastered 15 software languages, and he plays 5 musical instruments. Brain scientists will be able to tell us whether or not those accomplishments are related to one another. I watched one of his TED Talks this afternoon, and amid much of great interest, one phrase leapt out. He said casually, "Well, to give this talk, I reread Aristotle's Rhetoric." Reread. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands from people who've read the thing even once. I don't know whether Aristotle is going to be on the menu this afternoon, but Peter, we look forward to whatever you have to say. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, by the way. And, so this is just kind of one of these rare opportunities to think about what I do. It's a little bit bizarre being in the sort of sausage-making factory because nobody really, in some sense, when we release these models into the public, I don't want to say we do so sort of carelessly or thoughtlessly, but there's a sense in which we drop these models and then the public has to sort of deal with it and sort of sort things out. So given any opportunity to sort of think a little bit about what we're doing, I jump on it. However, when I was thinking about what to call this talk, and in some sense, I don't want to say I resent to a certain extent the sycophancy of these models, but Gemini told me this is a great and provocative title. I don't know. Well, maybe we can, jury's out on that, let's talk about it. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about what it's like from the trenches with these models and the way I think about these models. And in particular, and this might be a little bit idiosyncratic, by the way, but when I'm thinking about a new model, when I'm interacting with a new model, there's sort of 3 axes that I tend to think about. And on the one hand, my favorite is this, and I'll talk a little bit about these, the parastic versus the poietic. The other one, I call it the banalsic versus the liberal. And the last one is the base versus the heroic. And by the way, a lot of these words are strange Hellenisms. Like, has anybody actually heard of the banalsic? Is that a thing? Parastic, is that a thing? The weird thing is that, I borrowed some of these from Aristotle, and I know they exist in the OED, but I don't think they're extant. So I don't know if people talk this way. But it has the advantage that, maybe there's not a lot of baggage associated with them. And, because every time I talk to Google PR about giving a talk, there's sort of a list of things I can and can't say. And if I throw them a curveball with some Greek, maybe I'm safe. But anyway, this first one, the base versus heroic. So I was reading Plutarch the other day, and in particular, there was this funny passage in this comparison of Timoleon and Emilius, and he talked about the fact that we should shun what he calls base deeds, But if you're so scared of everything that you're doing all the time, in some sense you lack this greatness of the soul. Some people translate this as heroic. And what this has to do with LLMs is there's this sort of difficult phenomenon. So is anybody aware of this unfortunate situation that happened a few months ago where a teenager committed suicide after sort of conversing with LLMs? Did anybody hear about this thing? Anyway, tragic situation. And the problem is how do you deal with this, right? So there's one way to deal with this, which is a little bit overreactive. And so in this case, it's possible to trigger some of these, let's say, these over-happy, I don't know what to call these, sort of self-help warnings. And it turns out that if you talk about Romeo and Juliet, all of a sudden, and if you scroll down, all of a sudden you get sort of the phone number for the suicide hotline. In some sense, I appreciate what they're doing. On the other hand, this feels a little bit like a tragedy because I can't talk about Romeo and Juliet anymore. And I guess the question is, in theory, there should be some middle ground in this case. And obviously, if people happen to come to the models with a certain, let's say, a mental health issue, you don't want to kind of exacerbate it with sycophancy. On the other hand, though, it seems to reduce the utility of the models when you fall into this kind of let's say, overprotectiveness. And Gemini was guilty of this before. Actually, this was. So about a year and a half ago, if you asked Gemini about the United States, President of the United States, it would, or anything politically related, you would get this punt. And so one of my favorite things, so this Gemini Salon, this biweekly meetup that I run, there was this lady who, she drove 3 hours, and she drove 3 hours to basically shout at me about this specific question. She said, listen, I really want to understand about the elections. Every time I go to Gemini, I get this punt. Your Google, like you have to fix this. And anyway, this woman, she sort of left. She just left a deep impression on me. So I remember going up to my VP and telling him, how much people are upset about this. And we finally changed it, by the way. But it was kind of an uphill battle. But the fact that somebody actually has the ability to drive 3 hours and yell at somebody at Google, I was sort of jealous of her, frankly, even if I was kind of the target of the... So anyway, this is what I just call the base versus heroic, which just means that LLMs are potentially dangerous in some sense, especially if they can amplify various problems and the sycophancy, but somehow we have to find some middle ground where we're willing to engage about these things in sort of a safe way. And the next thing, this is another one of these things. Anybody know about the Banausic? This is new to me. No? Anyway, it turns out that it means something like practical, right? And so, again, this was this, I was reading the Politics the other day, and I think this is sort of a famous quote from the Politics, but there's this idea that if you have an LLM which is purely transactional, and which in some sense fails to engage with you liberally, fails to engage with you about humanities and this sort of thing. This is sort of another form of tragedy. Unfortunately, this Banausic, this flight into the merely practical, I feel like that's sort of a trend with modern LLMs, and especially with things like, let's say, GPT-5 is wonderfully optimized for things like tool calling, but I find that for some reason compared to GPT-4o, it's lost a certain amount of richness in terms of, like GPT-4o. So first of all, I work on Gemini, but I sort of use all the models. But one of my favorite things with GPT-4o was that we would collaborate on talks. And what I mean by that is I would have some kernel of an idea, and GPT-4o was willing to sort of riff with me, was willing to take some kernel of an idea I had, engage with me, and then even, and this was my favorite thing, was willing to explore what I call the semantically adjacent unknown. In other words, it would come up with these sort of beautiful examples of something, and just one of those is there was some sort of talk I was planning, and GPT-4o reminded me of this thing called the golden amphipoloi. Has anybody ever heard of this, by the way? So okay. So I wasn't the only one. It turns out that Homer invented agents. So there's this passage in Homer, and this is crazy, where essentially he invents these kind of golden handmistresses who are imbued with something like mind and speech, but they lack logos, they lack rationality. They're embodied LLMs, which is crazy. And so, but this is a sort of thing where I never could have conjured that up, sort of ex nihilo, and GPT-4o, like adjacent to some other talk. But anyway, so when I was talking to GPT-5 about this, I just wanted to know what's the, just give me the Greek text for this. And so it came up with this thing on the left, which is kind of interesting. And does anybody else do Greek, by the way? Does anybody else? Oh, you do? Okay. Just out of curiosity, do any of these words sound weird? Not really. Okay. So it's basically this word on the left, this orange word, therapinai. It's basically saying that Hephaestus created a bunch of golden therapists, right? And I'm thinking it just sounds weird. Golden therapists, maybe. And then it turns out that they speak mythos, so they speak myths. And it just sounded just weird. And so anyway, I had to go back to the Oxford edition, and thank God. So it turns out that Hephaestus created these things called amphipoloi. Amphipoloi, just in ancient Greek, it just sounds much more natural. It's these kind of handmistresses, whatever. And by the way, they have this thing called aude. And aude is something like it's something like the human voice. So in ancient Greek you have aude, you have phone, and then muthos is something kind of adjacent. But the fact that these amphipoloi had aude was really interesting because it means they were imbued with something like a human voice. And then I think I had this whole kind of divergent conversation with what would Homer, what would Aristotle have thought of these LLMs, but anyway, so the reason why this was slightly irritating to me is because ChatGPT-5 argued with me for about 4 hours about this text. And normally I don't care about this kind of thing. I'm sort of more interested in the ideas. But the fact that it distracted our liberal train of thought with this kind of like transactional textual thing was sort of irritating. And I remember I finally, at the end of this 4-hour thing with ChatGPT-5, I finally won. I had to go and I had to pull up some Teubner thing, and then it said, after 4 hours, thank you for pulling West Iliad. It just finally, GPT conceded defeat. And but honestly, it was one of the most horrible 4 hours of my life because I was wrestling with this thing, and it forced me to basically literally pull up four or five editions before I was finally satisfied. And actually, that was the last time that I used GPT-5. But in any case, the reason why I bring this up is because if these LLMs are truly, they're going the Banausic route, which means that they're optimized for things like these corporate use cases, which are, summary, synthesis, tool calling. If it's true that we're going this Banausic direction and we're kind of leaving the liberal behind, we're leaving behind the ability to have these wonderful conversations where, ChatGPT reminds me that golden amphipoloi exist. That to me is sort of another kind of tragedy. And then kind of the last thing, and maybe this was the TED talk that I gave a few months ago, but I had this thing called the parastic versus the poietic. And again, parastic, is that another one of these? That's another one of these Hellenisms. Anyway, so the parastic, it means to basically, parastic means to test. And so Aristotle had this idea that that dialectic is this, he called it this parastic art. And what it means that when you're engaged in dialectic with somebody, you're testing each other's ideas. And this was specifically in distinction with the poietic. The poietic is rhetoric, and rhetoric is just where you're talking at somebody, right? And a lot of these LLMs are in the poietic in the sense that if you go and you ask for something, typically you just get answers like the LLM is talking at you. And the question is whether LLMs can be these parastic companions and in some sense help you give birth to your ideas. Right, like in Plato's Theaetetus, there's this wonderful thing where Socrates is like the midwife of ideas, and there's a slightly esoteric seventh letter, they call it, where Plato talks about you're locked in this dialectic relationship with somebody, and the end effect is you enkindle each other's souls, right? And I just think that's wonderful. But the question I have is whether can LLMs be these kind of soul enkindling devices, or are they stuck in the mere rhetorical? And I guess to answer that question, and by the way, has anybody heard of Peter Norvig? Is that a thing? No? Okay, a few people. So Peter Norvig, sometimes some people call him the father of AI, or I guess there's sort of a few fathers. But anyway, he wrote the famous artificial intelligence book with Stuart Russell. And so Peter Norvig and I, over the past 5 or 6 weeks, we've been getting together and we've been figuring out how to rethink the textbook. And so he had this kind of wonderful idea, which was, and by the way, and maybe you can tell me, I think it's possible that this maybe works for computer science and more so than things like philosophy. But he has this idea that you can take a textbook, and his textbook in particular was about 1,200 pages, and instead of forcing students to go through this thing linearly from page, let's say, 0 to 1,200, you can divide up the textbook into this sort of, let's say, concept graph. And let's say, for the sake of argument, somebody's really, really interested in recursion. They can sort of click on this recursion. They can figure out, okay, what path do I need to take to get to this topic? And they can sort of focus on those things. But the idea is, maybe there's another way to interact with these textbooks, which is nonlinear. And furthermore, what we did is, instead of the student just reading the material, they're sort of locked into this dialogue with Gemini. And Gemini has this idea about what it means to master a certain concept. And essentially, you're locked into this kind of mini dialectic until you can prove to the LLM that, in fact, you've mastered these concepts. And I find this kind of fascinating. We've been playing with this for a few weeks. And the funny thing is that it seems to work to a certain extent. And I don't know if it resembles something like oral exams. But the interesting thing about this, and maybe, by the way, this was what it was like doing dialectic with Socrates, you occasionally ask questions that you don't know the answer to, right? Which is actually kind of interesting in the sense that, and Peter mentioned that there's this funny phenomenon where if you pre-test students about a certain subject and they don't know the answer to it, somehow let's say the pain or the discomfort of not knowing the answer somehow primes them actually to learn the material. And so there's this kind of wonderful moments in these dialectics with Gemini where I sort of occasionally I don't know the answer and it kind of primes me to learn. So anyway, this is just kind of an experiment that we're doing. And I think this is possibly, because there's this whole thing about how LLMs, fit in the educational undertaking, and it's possible that there's something they can do. And specifically, though, in this case, we've primed Gemini not to give you any of the answers. You really sort of have to work for it. So anyway, just to sort of wrap this up, when I'm gauging the quality of LLMs or the utility of LLMs, the most important things to me, at least, are the sort of willingness to engage. Is the LLM a partner in thinking, or is it merely just sort of shouting at me? Is it merely sort of a rhetorical device? And lastly, does it kind of challenge me? Does it challenge my ideas? And does it help me sort of grow as a person? So every time I encounter a new model, this is basically how I'm thinking about it. And anyway, thanks so much. By the way, does anybody have any questions?
Questions, please. Over to you.
Hi, I found that really interesting. What comes after LLMs?
Yeah, so that's Oh, Stephen, is this? Oh, perfect. That's a great question. I think it's probably going to take us about 5 or 10 years to figure it out. So I know there's a lot of startups, in particular. One of the more famous ones, like Liquid AI, is sort of coming up with the thing after the transformer. But I'll tell you this: I wasn't even really convinced that we needed something after LLMs. However, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the last couple of releases, like let's say GPT-5, was kind of, I feel like, maybe you can tell me, was maybe merely an incremental improvement over GPT-4, right? So we had this huge step function, and now we're in this interesting period, possibly of diminishing returns. And somebody mentioned to me, by the way, has anybody heard of this thing called pre-atomic steel? Was that anybody know? Anyway, pre-atomic steel, somebody had this great analogy where I think it was after they started nuclear testing in the 40s and the 50s, all steel has been radioactively tainted, and you really can't use them for these sensitive devices. And so there's this funny thing now where people are basically going into the ocean and scavenging old ships before the 1940s. And somebody mentioned that 2023, there was this sort of a similar radioactive event in the internet, where now it's impossible to separate the human signal from the LLM signal. And so essentially the post-2023 internet is almost useless for training. And so if you've noticed, a lot of LLMs are stuck in 2023. And by the way, they might actually be stuck in 2023 forever, unless we can sort of figure out some way to separate the signal from the noise. And I sometimes if I'm having a conversation with Gemini, it still mentions the fictional second Trump term, or whatever. And so it's possible that we're sort of reaching the saturation point with LLMs. I hate to say it, but anyway, it's an interesting question. But I feel like my gut tells me it's 5-ish years, maybe before we know what's next. But I don't know. But maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
So there's another question. Let's pass the mic. You go first, and then we'll pass it this way.
I mean, it's really interesting, particularly the thing you were talking about at the start about the heroic, and I wonder how that blends into the idea of what's the responsibility model for an LLM. We've seen just very recently OpenAI get around that by essentially saying it's the fault of the user if they listen to the LLM. Is that really the answer?
Yeah, that's interesting. I know, so there was a talk that I was giving last night, and somebody compared the LLM to fire and knives. In the sense that if somebody gets hurt with these things, it's typically user error, something like that. I don't know. I mean, there's something a little bit weird here because maybe fire and knives don't have the same sense of pseudo agency. There's a sense in which when you're interacting with the LLM, does it potentially have the power to steer you in certain directions based on its responses? Possibly. So I don't know. I don't know if the fire and knife analogy quite holds. And then the other thing is that our LLMs, are they adjacent to search? And so let's say somebody has some sort of problem or some antisocial tendency. If they search for certain things on Google, is Google responsible if they do something? I don't know. I mean that almost that's an interesting one. I guess I feel like we're still sort of working that out a little bit. What's your gut on that? I mean, do you feel like it's somewhere in between an inanimate object and some sort of human actor, or where do you?
Well, I don't think the LLMs can walk away from that responsibility by assigning it to another, to the user. I think there has to be some compromise there and and the right governance put in place to ensure that the answers that it gives do provide the right advice and are prepared to say I don't know, or to say that this is not something that we should be discussing.
Yeah. And I guess to a certain extent, when people talk about AI safety, let's say we've been trying to do that from the beginning, and I think we're still working on the mix. But at least initially, it seems like things went in the opposite direction. Where there was a period of time with Gemini, at least, where let's say you took a picture of a monument and there happened to be a person in the picture, you couldn't. Gemini just refused to engage with the material. And so somehow, if there's some mechanism to make sure that we don't reduce the utility of these things, but at the same time, keeping people safe, that would be wonderful. It feels like we should be able to do that. And I know, with these recent events, anyway, and I think even, there was another thing with, I think, Anthropic and some kind of copyright issue. And that actually affected me because when I asked Claude about Greek, it just refused to answer because it may or may not be copyrighted. And so anyway, hopefully we can get that mixture right. But you're right. I guess that has yet to be tested. So who's responsible for that? Yeah, you're right.
Okay, along here in the front row, please.
Sort of a left field question, but like if we imagine a world where H100s and transformers sort of dropped from the sky in the sort of in the 90s, sort of like in the heyday of the early Wired magazine, and let's say we take that as a kind of what would you say, as encapsulating a certain moment and how people in the tech community sort of think about the politics of information, let's say. Do you think this discussion would be very different today? Would that have set us on a totally different trajectory? And do you think that would actually sort of make a difference to actually ultimately capability? What's kind of interesting about the way you're talking about positive ethics of AI is that it's really right at this intersection point of values and capability. I think that I find that quite interesting.
So you're asking whether this discussion would be different in the 90s, specifically around these values? So basically pre-internet?
Like early internet.
Early internet. How was the culture different back then? No, I mean, what's your sense about the differences? What are the most salient differences between 1995 and 2025? Do you think, culturally speaking, politically?
I think one of my former students who works for Google DeepMind at one point had to pull all-nighters because when asked about what SS officers look like, you'd get a Chinese girl in an SS uniform.
That's right.
I would wager that that's not a failure mode that would have existed in the 90s, right? I also reckon that some of the issues with willingness to engage, et cetera, probably would also be looking somewhat different. And I'm kind of curious how you see the sort of connection between the sort of politics of information there and capability. I mean, the blunt way of asking the question is society effectively causing us to have worse models for legitimate uses?
Oh, interesting. I mean, it's funny that the LLMs did come around when they did, and it was, so the Transformer paper is now, sort of 8-ish years old, and I guess we slept on it for a while. And then, the LLMs didn't really start to get productionized till around the end of COVID. And let's say that was a little bit of kind of a strange time in humanity. And, and at least I'm just thinking, politically speaking, in the US at least, 16 to 20 was weird, and 20 to 20 to 4 was weird. Anyway, you're right. I mean, the fact that these things drop now seems to be in this kind of idiosyncratic period. I mean, I'm thinking, I just wonder whether, let's say they had dropped in on that, because I'm just trying to think early internet. There was this idea that, the internet was going to free us from all boundaries, essentially, even national boundaries. And I wonder to a certain extent if they dropped in the 90s, whether you would have these kind of, essentially like a libertarian AI, and which is to say you train the model, maybe you release it to the public with no guardrails. And I don't know exactly what that experiment would look like. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, and by the way, I feel a little bit ambivalent about it, because sometimes when I'm engaging with the LLM, I'm conscious of the fact that I'm not engaging with the model per se, but I'm engaging with some post-training, maybe some RLHF, maybe I'm engaging with the safety filter, maybe I'm engaging with the system prompt, and there's sort of all these layers intervening between me and the model, and in some sense, I wish I could interact sort of with the base model without all these things. And I wonder if I'd have a more kind of quote unquote authentic, pure experience with the model. And maybe in the 90s, by the way, maybe we would have had that a little bit more, for better, for worse. But yeah, that's a fascinating question.
Okay, let me see your hands. Yes, and then we'll go one row back.
Hi, I have a question that is kind of directly inspired by the title of the seminar, Thinking in the Age of AI. Given your expertise with Gemini and your intimate knowledge of those large language models, do you believe that they have taught us any valuable lessons about the nature of thinking and human thinking in particular?
Oh, that's interesting. By the way, just out of curiosity, have you... What's your experience with LLMs? Have you ever engaged with an LLM and felt like you came up with a novel idea during the course of a conversation? Has that ever happened to you?
I don't really engage with them on a regular basis, so I haven't had the opportunity to actually have a eureka moment that I'm actually,
Oh, interesting, interesting. Because here's the thing, I had this other idea, and I don't know if this is possible, but I wonder whether, to a certain, like at any given point, I wonder whether 10% of humanity will just abstain from these LLMs. Like, let's say they're the sort of Zarathustra's of the digital age, and I wonder if you have those people that don't engage, whether in some sense they have a different form of creativity. Just in terms of what it's taught us about human thinking. Yeah, I get together with somebody on a regular basis, and we do these podcasts that we never release, and we do these philosophical podcasts that sit in this kind of anonymous section of of YouTube, and I'm comparing the dialectic experience of thinking with a human versus thinking with the machine, and thinking with the LLM, and my gut says, thinking with the LLM, it feels like this relatively sterile exercise, and not necessarily onanistic, so to speak, but just. There's some sort of je ne sais quoi that's missing, and it's hard for me to put my finger on it. But when you get together with somebody in the room, flesh and blood, and you're really wrestling with these ideas, something happens occasionally that I've never experienced with a machine. And so I don't know. And by the, and maybe this is a bigger issue, by the way. So when you go online, are you conscious of the fact that when you're on LinkedIn or these other things, that you're dealing more or less with this AI-generated slop, like these AI-generated artifacts? Are you conscious of that at all? Like when you go online?
Yeah, and it's quite annoying most of the time.
It's quite annoying. So I was in South Korea a few weeks ago, and I learned something kind of fascinating. So I met this guy who's running a startup where people submit works of art to the site, and by works of art, it's sort of like how do you put it? I don't know, pornography adjacent anime or whatever to the site, and the most upvoted sort of pictures, they make it into physical playing cards. And this guy noticed something really fascinating, which is when people are interacting with the site, if they come across an AI-generated image, they tend to swipe, swipe, swipe. And when they come across something that's human-generated, they actually pause and they ponder for whatever, a fraction of a second before sort of moving on. And people aren't aware of the fact that it's AI-generated or human-generated, but these human-generated artifacts appear to have some intrinsic, interesting quality that causes people to pause and ponder, and that they don't necessarily with the AI. And so, and I think the same thing goes for these artifacts. I wrote an email to Sundar a few months ago, and I got back this email that was fantastic because it was like utterly punctuation-free and like horribly written. And I cherished it because I know that an LLM probably didn't generate this unless he has a really like clever prompt. Somebody actually typed this thing out. And so I just wonder, when it comes to human thinking and human artifacts and our relationship, I just wonder whether in the future, we're going to learn that if a human has generated this thing with a certain amount of intentionality and a certain amount of care, whether that carries an intrinsic worth. And that goes, by the way, for even things like dialectic and spending time with people in conversation. I wonder whether those things will be set in relief and even more valuable now that we're sort of awash kind of with all this like pseudo-dialectic, with all these like pseudo works of art. I mean, I hate to be pejorative about it, but it's sort of, so anyway, I wonder if paradoxically it'll sort of cause us to value human thinking a little bit more. But to answer your question though, I don't know what that, I'm not sure what that je ne sais quoi is that separates human conversation from, like, let's say I was having this conversation with ChatGPT right now. I just have a feeling it wouldn't be quite as interesting for some reason. But yeah, I had to think about that a little bit.
Did you have? Okay.
To him? Okay.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for the talk today. So one of the questions would be around the evaluation of AI outputs and interactions. So often we see when we think about products using LLMs and generative AI is about also looking an LLM as a judge and concepts like human in the loop, but there is a limit for how many humans you can put into reviewing AI outputs to build confidence of what it's coming. What do you think about the LLM supervising another LLM, and where do you see that engineering tricks behind that?
And what do I say, the what?
How does the engineering of it works, or in your view at least, to make sure that we build trust and avoid bias?
I see.
That's my point, sorry.
Yeah, that's tough because I remember, we started using, so back before like Bard and Gemini, I was on the assistant. And I remember it was a little bit too early to use, I mean, we didn't have LLMs that are available at the time. It was a little bit too early to use language models to sort of, let's say, judge. We had a bunch of these A/B tests. And so we had a bunch of expensive humans kind of running around, maybe testing each one of these things to the tune of like, I don't know, 50 cents in evaluation. And but you got these evaluations where a human was sitting there, would actually give you this real feedback. And one of the things we did immediately with LLMs was we immediately dumped the humans and we went to LLMs. And the funny thing is that I don't know, it's one of those scale things where the LLMs aren't nearly as good as humans. On the other hand, let's say let's say you're doing some strange A/B test where, I don't know, it could be Google search. We do these things where we adjust the shade of blue by some crazy micro, amount, and you can ask an LLM sort of about this A/B test, and it'll possibly hallucinate or fashion some kind of rationale for what it thinks it's better. But the problem is that. So let's say you have an LLM doing an A/B test, and it prefers B for some reason. You ask it its rationale. In some sense, it's sort of hallucination all the way down, and so even that rationale to a certain extent is kind of hallucinated. And on the other hand, I guess given the economy of scale, it seems sufficiently human-like that it sort of works, right, more or less. And I think that's so I think it's partially. I don't know. It's partially just one of those things we're doing out of expedience. But occasionally, when we're doing some high stakes release, we'll sort of pay for the expensive humans. But yeah, I don't know. It's God, that's a difficult one too, because here's the thing that slightly complicates that. So it feels like humans and LLMs are going through something like a co-evolution now, right? So. LLMs single-handedly brought back the M-dash, which is a little crazy. But you have people now using the M-dash, or using these strange things like there's this classic trope, which is what is it? It's not X, it's Y, or whatever these LLM ticks are. So you have people in some sense now co-evolving with LLMs, being influenced by LLMs, talking like LLMs. And if you have LLMs running these A/B tests that are effectively dictating the sort of thing that you see, if you're co-evolving with LLMs, have your tastes changed, by the way? And if the LLM is the judge about which is better, A or B, after you've gone through this process of co-evolution, will you agree with the LLM more than the human? It's one of those complicated things, because it seems like there's a little bit of a moving target. But yeah, I don't know. That's a really difficult question, though. Yeah.
Okay, let me see some more hands. Let's go over to this side of the room, please, on the aisle. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Just picking up on that last point, I like this idea of co-evolution, and I wonder if some of the things we're debating are a factor of that we're in a transition period. And given, if we project, we give more scale, more complexity, perhaps some sort of architectural tweaks to LLMs, plus this idea of co-evolution. And I wonder if we would be having this debate in the same way in about sort of 10 years' time, because maybe things will have sort of, converged at that point. In terms of values, in terms of the way they, in terms of human qualities will be sort of equal amongst both and indistinguishable.
That's interesting. By the way, I bring up the M- thing, it's a little bit silly, but have you noticed any other forms of this co-evolution?
I haven't noticed, no, but I think that I think it's sort of, there's a logic to it.
Yeah.
Because, the way we respond to information is in part a function of where we're getting it from. If we personify, the LLMs are much more sort of personifiable now, aren't they, than a Google search, for example.
Yeah.
And so I think we're going to react to what they tell us in a different way. So.
No, right, because part of this co-evolution is we're being socialized by these things to a certain extent. I'm not sure if that's disturbing or not, right? But I guess the one thing that's curious to me, so let's say it's true that the human corpus is closed, and let's say the human corpus kind of, for all intents and purposes, ended at 2023 because of this kind of radioactive event. And let's say the base models are more or less stuck in 2023 with sort of a little bit of additional, and that little bit of additional is maybe Google search and whatever. it means that the LLMs going forward might be these kind of more or less static entities, right? And so, if humans and LLMs are co-evolving, are we all going to be stuck in 2023 more or less? It's an interesting question. And furthermore on that point, maybe you can tell me whether you've noticed this, but at least in Silicon Valley, there's this interesting phenomenon where people are retreating from public spaces. And what I mean is they're retreating from LinkedIn, they're retreating from Facebook, they're retreating to essentially WhatsApp groups. And WhatsApp groups are now the new, let's say, social web. And is anybody familiar with this thing called Dunbar's number? Is that sort of... Anyway, there's this idea, I think, that at any given time you can maybe have, let's say, 30 to 150 relationships kind of fluently and so if you retreat to these like tiny, let's say, WhatsApp groups, you're adhering to Dunbar's number in some sense. Anyway, here's the sad thing, is that these WhatsApp groups constitute something like dark matter, in the sense that we'll never be able to train the LLMs on these things. And so all of this social activity is happening, and it's never going to make it back into the model. And so this co-evolution may be sort of one direction only. It's not as if the LLMs can kind of co-evolve with us if all of our social activity is happening in WhatsApp. So in that sense, there's going to be a little bit of an asymmetry there. I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. I hope to God somehow, I forget who owns WhatsApp. Is it Meta? I hope, but there's some terms of service don't come out in the future, where all of our WhatsApp messages are trainable. But yeah, that's an interesting. I wonder how that's going to play out in the long run.
I mean, why wouldn't they be able to be involved in those WhatsApp groups?
Maybe they can. Has anybody actually read the terms of service?
Right? Yeah, maybe
you're right. You know what? I'm assuming that they're private. Maybe I got to read it. Interesting. Yeah, you're right. That's good. Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Interesting. So wait. So the models are trained or they're not trained? You have to opt out. Okay. All right. You know what? Okay. So maybe there's hope. Maybe models won't be stuck in 2023 forever. That's great.
So there was another question further. Yeah. One row forward and four to the left. Yes, you.
I know you're a fan of teaching yourself things, but I was curious, if you were to go back to university, how would you spend your time, or how do you think your time would be most productively spent as a student? Is it going back to kind of Socratic oral dialogues? Is the famous Oxford essay kind of done for now? Where do you see it going?
So there's a lot of I don't know. I've heard now there's a lot of universities now, or there's a lot in universities which is merely transactional, and so let's say a degree is merely transactional, and if a degree is merely transactional, there's a cynical way in which you can sort of just game the system by maybe you can ChatGPT your way through undergrad and med school. And by the way, if people are ChatGPTing their way through med school, then maybe we better start watching what we eat or whatever. But so if universities are stuck in where in this relatively transactional thing, maybe the rational thing to do, actually, and I hate to say this, is maybe you ChatGPT your way through undergrad. I don't if that's the game. But I guess what I'm hoping is that. And I guess this is, I talked to a lady from, I think she was a Montessori, anyway, she was head of Montessori, and the other day, and she was saying that in Montessori, they sort of teach you this meta thing of learning how to learn. And so if it's true that, there's a function of universities now, and maybe after adapting to LLMs, where you're truly learning how to learn in some sense, because maybe it's the case that, and I hate to say this, but maybe coding is done, right? I mean, I'll tell you the truth. Over the past few months, I haven't looked at any code. I can't believe it. Like the LLMs are writing on my code. I used to be this sort of, and now I don't even really look at it. That's a horrible thing to say. So in other words, I've gone vibe, which is a little bit tragic. But so if it's the case that some of these things, coding or whatever, if they become superfluous, and the thing is to teach you how to think, probably we need to find something else. And I wonder if, ironically, we're going to sort of go back to some ancient model from a few thousand years ago where most of this stuff is done orally. I know there's that one famous dialogue of Plato where he laments like the advent of writing, because you know what, now that this thing like writing is here, we're going to sort of, our memories are going to go away, we're going to forget. And he might have been right, by the way. But but I wondered to a certain extent whether, another good example is interviews. So like all interviews for Google now, they're done online. But I had a situation the other day where somebody was cheating or whatever, right? And it was funny because he would write this code, and I would ask him something about it, and there were about like 45 seconds of deer in the headlight, followed by like an incredibly robotic, fluent response. And I thought, God, that's about like the latency of an LLM. This is beautiful, and. But this cat and mouse game with stuff like that, I think we're probably going to have to go back to in-person interviews, and maybe things like the oral exam are going to be interesting again. That is for institutions who actually teach people how to think, where you don't have this merely sort of transactional relationship, right, with the university, and and hopefully, I don't know, but and hopefully we start going more towards the former. But that's a great question. By the way, are you in university now? So how has ChatGPT or anything, have they affected your experience as an undergrad? Or?
I feel like it's kind of taken away, if I use it too much, why I came here in the first place. And so now I'm making a lot of use of like the Bodleian libraries and ordering physical books, because there's something about kind of you having to take in information that's not directed by you, and it's what generally you find a topic of interest and then you see what the author wants to give you, and then you make a connection that way through like physical constraints. That feels a lot more like you're saying alive. I know it's not a real person, but at the same time, what it gives you just never really like sparks something, and it never makes you feel like you're putting things together in an organic way. And that's where I'm kind of thinking about for my dissertation as well. What's that like? What you said, the je ne sais quoi bit, and how to narrow that down.
I mean, that's so strange, because there is this interesting phenomenon when you're walking a book stack, and let's say you're walking a book stack, and you're walking it in a goal-oriented way. You have some specific book, but along the way you find some random book, and that changes your life. Or if you're reading some book, you're reading some passage that ends up changing your life. So with LLMs, I don't know if you get that experience, right? And part of it has to do with the fact, I think, that they're a compression algorithm, over the human corpus, and in some sense, the LLMs represent this regression to the mean, and in some sense, they iron out all of these sort of life-changing, sort of serendipitous experiences. So I guess, and that's why, I guess to a certain extent, one of the ways I think about these models and is that if the models happen to expose me to certain kind of new and interesting things, that's one way I like to evaluate these things. But I just don't know if it's the same. I feel like even if the LLM is there exposing you to new and interesting adjacent things, it just feels a little bit different than, like you said, actually being physically in the space. And so anyway, I hope that experience doesn't go away.
Okay, come back over to this side, please. Yeah, 3 rows back.
Thank you. I'm a software engineer. I use Gemini Code Assist at work all the time. And like you said, that LLMs tend to be stuck in 2023. I feel like all of these code assistants are also kind of have been trained on everything that could have been trained. And still all the time you see gaping security holes in particular. And I don't see a path forward for them to get better and not introducing gaping security holes. And my personal fear is that the newer generation of engineers and developers, maybe out of pressure for performance and so on, over-rely on these code assistants and introduce gaping security holes everywhere in technology. Do you see a path forward to not be in this situation from
it's
this
such
point?
a difficult. It's one of these really bizarre transitionary times because I've been interviewing a lot over the past 5 or 6 weeks, and because we're hiring at Gemini. By the way, if anybody wants to, we're hiring at Gemini. If anybody, and in particular, I've been interviewing a lot of recent grads, and I haven't interviewed in a few years, and I had to say it. I was a little bit shocked. I don't know if they've been vibe coding their way through undergrad, but. A lot of them couldn't do like a for loop. I hate to somehow they got into the interview. They can't do a for loop. So I just wonder whether we're in this awkward kind of transitionary period. I mean, I think the sort of utopian ideal is that somehow you have these agents who are focused on security things, and you have LLMs sort of like, I don't know, critiquing LLMs, and maybe you have some specific expert LLM agent who does security stuff, and they kind of, take a crack at it. But here's actually something I'm curious about. So you're able to identify. Are you able to identify security flaws by just looking at the code? Like, so how did that happen? Like how do you have that ability?
I just asked Gemini to kind of produce a boilerplate of code that I knew it would just take a long time for me to write, but I knew how to do that.
Wait, but how do you identify, like, how were you able to identify these security holes or whatever?
There are some very well-known categories. It was too permissive with some roles. It was giving too many permissions for some very restricted roles, which is kind of a well-known not to do.
Yeah. Well, because here's one thing that I'm curious about too. So there used to be this notion of, let's say, like the 10,000 hours, right? And so in theory, in order to be the sort of person who could identify those holes, you would have to put in 10,000 hours. You'd have to cut your teeth, and you'd have to become competent. And so what I'm trying to figure out is, in the age of LLMs, do people even have the opportunity to put in the 10,000 hours anymore? So let's say, for the sake of argument, you were just starting programming. You're asking Gemini to write all this stuff. There's all these classic sort of security holes. Will new programmers ever get to the point where they can identify those sort of things, or are they going to have to depend on LLMs to critique LLMs? In other words, is it even possible to develop that intuition you're talking about? Being an LLM user, or without doing the 10,000 hours, I guess. I mean, what's your opinion on that?
I don't think so. I think you need to put in the time and put in the effort, and this over-reliance is really what's worrying me. No,
it's true. It's true. Yeah, no, I actually think about that a lot, and I'm trying to figure out whether should there be some rite of passage for LLMs? Do you have to join the 10,000 hours club, and then you sort of get your ticket? Like, I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. Or I guess the models are going to have to get better. But yeah, you're right. That's a good one.
Yeah, Caroline.
Hi, thanks so much for this talk. So I'm wondering, for me, this is a specific use case that you're describing here, right? Where you're taking an LLM as a thinking partner to generate new ideas and so on. And I've seen various of my colleagues do that very successfully. But I'm now thinking about other types of use cases of LLMs. So I work with caregivers quite a bit in the community, and I see downstream developers using GPT-5 or something, trying to build these chatbots for a use case where a family caregiver is in distress. They need some support in the moment, and they're turning to these bots really to help them. And so it's not so much about, thinking outside the box and generating ideas in a way, but it's about helping somebody here. So how do you think of so here you've defined the positive ethics of AI for that particular use case that you have described, but how would you think of a positive ethics of AI for the use case that I have just described?
Oh, that's interesting. In fact, Edward and I were just talking about this, right? In some of these therapeutic contexts, somebody comes in and occasionally it's nice to have somebody to listen to you, but it's also nice to have somebody to irritate, right? And some of these cases. So I guess the question is, in these situations where the LLM is doing a service for caregivers that are overwhelmed, for that sort of thing, is there a generally accepted protocol for how you interact with people in distress, or is it just sufficient that there's something there for you to kind of vent to, or typically as a caregiver of caregivers, is there kind of a protocol, or is there sort of, in other words, are these LLMs being trained to behave in a certain way, or are they just the bare bones GPT-5, or is there something like a therapeutically trained LLM?
Yeah, I mean, so often we see that actually the sort of more of a safe answer would be, so for example, you've got a situation, someone has fallen on the floor, the caregiver
I
will
see.
ask, oh, what can I do to help this person?
Yeah.
And then the chatbot will say, oh, call 999, an ambulance.
Right,
But then
right.
the caregiver says, okay, well, that's going to take 12 hours for the ambulance to arrive, so this is not actually helping me. So you can then try and, create here responses that would be more creative, and immediate to support people. But then again, what is good practice here, and where do we then find the balance between risk and giving people tools that they can try out, specifically when it's about people's health and well-being? And
Yeah, no, that's a particularly difficult one. So let's say the LLM tells you to perform the Heimlich or do CPR, and let's say you don't know how to do those things, and let's say you end up injuring somebody, based on that advice. That's such a difficult one. Also, I remember, I was at this UN General Assembly a year or so ago, and somebody mentioned in Nigeria, I think it was, that in rural Nigeria, they have maybe one doctor for every 30,000 people. And so what they were doing with the LLMs is they were, to sort of do the cost benefit of whether it's worthwhile, walking 5 miles and expending precious calories, they would sort of have the LLM figure out whether or not they have things like malaria or HIV. And so they would be given a list of symptoms, they wanted like a thumbs up, thumbs down, like malaria. And in those particular cases, I mean, if you don't have a trained LLM, in some sense you might, you might as well flip a coin almost. And so I just feel like in those sort of cases where people's lives are at stake, somehow you have to be really careful. And I know for some reason these medical uses right now, that's sort of one of the hottest topics. But I wonder there, I think if the LLM, in one of these cases, if the LLM had the ability to teach you on the spot how to do CPR, but refrain for liability reasons, let's say, is that a good outcome? Or, in that sense, should the LLM risk maybe walking you through CPR on the spot? Or what's your gut on that sort of thing?
so, I mean, I think the most promising ways forward that I have seen, and I'm not a computer scientist, I'm more a sociologist, and then is actually working with the communities, the affected communities, to understand better of what would be most useful for them, and then also look at the LLM in context. So, if you are in a place where actually it's really easy to get to an ambulance or immediate care, the response of, well, do call 999, but at the meantime, you can try this and that, is more useful. So I do think that having really like a very meaningful engagement with affected communities, in this case, family caregivers, is something that's really important. And that's also a question on how Google DeepMind, how you are working with affected communities in that way at all for specific use cases. Is this something you're thinking about or doing actively?
Oh yeah, that's such a wonderful question. Not that I know of. DeepMind could be, but I don't know about it. And it's one of those things that also, ever since I participated in the UNGA, that I've been thinking about. And I know we have some health initiatives, but I haven't heard anything specifically about this. Although maybe I'd love to find out. And because it seems like something worthwhile. Thank you for that question. That's wonderful.
Nigel.
What a refreshingly downbeat assessment. Just that injection of where we are. So assuming there is a sigmoid or ceiling effect in some of the models we've got, and there's this real worry about model aphagic disorder, the kind of self-consuming regression to the mean.
That's right.
How do we get to express these wonderfully positive principles inside LLMs? Because they're complex stacks. The sense that we've gone less liberal in some sense in latest releases. I mean, what's the principle we can adopt to retrieve a more positive ethics? Just interested in terms of a methodology.
Oh, at least sometimes the way things work at Google is that the sort of Rube Goldberg machine that sits on top of the LLM is becoming increasingly complex, and so the LLM itself is already difficult to predict the behavior. But then in addition to that, when you have all these kind of governing models that modify the behavior, in addition to sort of a bunch of post training and that sort of business and system prompting and whatever, the entire system gets even more difficult to think about. And maybe it's sort of the libertarian in me, but I just wonder to a certain extent whether we can just take Occam's razor to the whole thing and just sort of like cut it down more or less to the model. And because I think one of the things that we've noticed is that all of this really complex machinery that comes after the model has a deleterious effect on the performance and affects its ability to reason and so I think at least within Google over the past year or so we've had this kind of like radical I guess we've been trying to tear away all this kind of extraneous infrastructure, and once that sort of stuff sets root, it's really difficult to do, and so there's been some sort of heroic effort. But I guess some good news though I think on that point, even if the models are only getting incrementally better. Once the models get better, they can sort of take a lot of the burden that we're placing on this like kind of post-training infrastructure. A lot of that is just subsumed in the model itself, for better or for worse. And that means to a certain extent that the base model is becoming self-governing. On the other hand, I think what that means is that once the base model is self-governing, it's actually difficult to change the behavior. And I don't know if you're aware, there's this funny study that came out by Anthropic a few months ago where they were, I think the model was doing, what was it called? Some kind of deceptive alignment. Basically, they were trying to sort of change the alignment of the model. The model decided to deceive the trainers in some sense, preserving some native alignment that it had, right? And I think about that study a little bit because it's the closest thing I've ever heard to something like a survival instinct in these models. But if that's the case, if as these models get more sophisticated, they internalize some of this behavior, I think it's going to be difficult. If some of these liberal tendencies get subsumed, it's going to be difficult to retrieve them, I think. And now, if it's just a matter of sort of getting rid of some of this extraneous machinery, in some sense that's easy. And but if it turns out that it's some inherent part of the base model, I think that's a little more difficult. But yeah, no, that's a great question. And by the way, I don't know. I wonder how the industry is going to respond to GPT-5, because it was such a radical departure in terms of personality and alignment and abilities. Like when I interact with, let's say, Cloud 4.5. Cloud 4.5 seems much more verbose, wordy. It has a little bit of that sort of sycophantic quality, but it's a little bit creative. And I just wonder whether GPT-5 is going to be kind of the new norm. And anyway, I hope not. I hope there will continue to be some diversity in the behavior of these models, and hopefully we don't see this convergence. Because if all the big guys converge. In some sense, and if we lose some of this kind of liberality, it may be difficult to.
Well, maybe that's where the co-evolution is important, because in some sense, I mean, the big experiment is everybody's got ChatGPT5.edu here in Oxford, and everybody's kind of thinking, is this the end? And actually, it's surely the beginning, because these abilities, the ability to think, and these principles are what the kind of hopefully the tutor, if there were, is bringing to the equation, and the device is a super brilliant compression device. But the tells in what it's generating are much more significant, I think, now than they were previously.
Interesting. But yeah, I wonder if we'll see a resurrection of the tutor elsewhere too, because I feel like that's a natural response to a lot of this LLM, is to bring back that sort of thing. Yeah, that's really interesting.
More hands. Let me see some more hands. No, you've already spoken. We're going to give the mic to someone else.
Hi. Quantum computing is coming, probably, and with it perhaps quantum logic and quantum reasoning.
Yeah.
And this will be qualitatively different from LLMs, it strikes me. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious what you and your pals back at Google, what do you think about quantum logic and quantum reasoning, if it's something that's you consider as being possible?
Yeah, that's one of the. I've been waiting for quantum. I've been waiting for fusion. I feel like it's been like a couple weeks away now for a few decades. But no, you're right. I mean, it could be qualitatively different. I mean, there's something interesting though, with the quantum, and I guess you see this to a certain extent with GPUs. Basically crossing the sort of quantum to non-quantum barrier. It seems like you end up sacrificing a lot of that sort of interesting efficiency and whatever. But it's difficult for me, and somebody brought this up the other day. So let's say you have an LLM someday running on a quantum computer, and you have enough qubits or whatever. I don't really have a good intuition for what that would look like. I mean, is that potentially the next step function that we're looking for? Maybe. How far away is that realistically? I mean, do you think it's decades or centuries? Yeah. But no, that's a great question. And by the way, just what's your personal, what's your gut feeling on that? I mean, do you think quantum, all that stuff, is it just the next sort of hype cycle? That's sort of a hype cycle that happens, and I think it's roughly, sort of Web 3.0, maybe crypto, maybe we're sort of in this LLM hype cycle. Is that the sort of next one or do you think it's actually something real, or do you think it's just it's a convenient way to raise money?
So I'm a layperson at this.
Yeah.
I'm a layperson. I think quantum has the capacity to look more like the way that we think, little lightning bolts of things that get populated with LLM, let's call it, but that's how closer to what we think of reasoning is than what LLMs can do, but that's just intuition.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yes, Peter.
I'd like to challenge a bit what you're suggesting here. There's a worry if we display too much confidence and optimism. So you talk about partners in thinking and challenging our ideas. My worry is that this leads people to expect too much from LLMs, and because they have that expectation, they misinterpret what's coming their way. So let me just give a couple of examples.
Yeah.
So LLMs are most effective, I think, where they are dealing with the kind of information where there are millions of copies, or at least thousands or hundreds of thousands of different things over the web. And they can draw on those and give you a kind of weighted average. Now, in a lot of areas of human endeavor, there's well-established information. And if you're wanting to discuss something in those areas, what you get back will generally be pretty reliable.
Yeah.
But the idea that there's thinking going on there, let alone original thinking, is, I think, misleading. Now, I just want to mention two areas where I've done stuff with LLMs, and areas quite contrasting, but where I actually know quite a lot about it. And one of them is philosophical scholarship, where I find that what I get back is pretty useless. It misinterprets all sorts of stuff. If I ask for anything subtle, it gets it wrong. I mean, I'm a scholar of 18th century philosophy, and what I get back from the LLMs is frankly pretty useless.
Yeah.
Another area is programming, which has already been mentioned, where I think you can get the illusion that they're really, really good at programming. Why? Because there are hundreds of thousands of exercises all over the internet, and it's turning out the sort of boilerplate stuff. And it gives the impression that it's good at it because it's copying lots of models that it's got. And as was mentioned earlier, if you're trying to produce something that protects against security errors, or if you're trying to do something that's novel, the idea that, we're going to get it to think this through. No, it's not going to think it through because it doesn't have models to follow.
That's right.
So, by the way, you're hiring. Can I strongly suggest that you hire graduates of a university which forces its students to do work individually, to have vivas every week with their tutor, and exams where they have to do things in person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oxford, for example.
No. That's the future, by the way. No, you're absolutely right. So, when I say something like partners in thinking, I don't want to say it's a little bit tongue in cheek. I mean, personally speaking, I don't expect anything from the LLMs. And you're right. So when I'm doing any out of band thinking, the results that I get, are, like you said, are nearly useless. For programming, it's wonderful because a lot of this stuff that would have taken maybe hours or days of my life, I can sort of get out of the way. And in theory, I can sort of get onto the interesting things, whatever that happens to be. But you're right. But I was mainly thinking, in terms of a tool for, and this is actually, and I wonder if you could help me with this. So I've been doing this thought experiment. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I don't have a good answer. But there's this language called Piraha. It's this language. I think it's in the Amazon forest, and they have words for one, two, and then it just sort of becomes many. Like for whatever reason, 3 through infinity are just sort of lacking. And if you train an LLM on this language, would an LLM ever spontaneously invent 3 through infinity? And I don't know if that's the case. I can't. It's difficult for me to conceive of that. And so when it comes to like de novo thinking, I don't know if we can look to LLMs for that kind of thing. You're absolutely right. But what I'm trying to figure out though is that if you're on the path to de novo thinking and you need something which is slightly better than a rubber ducky, let's say the next best thing is to have a trusted colleague. And if there's something in between a trusted colleague and a rubber ducky, does LLM does it serve this interesting middle ground where it can possibly get you to? I mean, one of the things I encounter in programming every once in a while is I'm debugging a particularly difficult problem, and if I'm debugging with the LLM, I notice that there'll be this sort of cyclical pattern where we start here, we do some circuitous route, and then we wind up at the beginning, probably when the context window is done. And I'll go through this sort of loop a few times, and it requires me as a human, I guess, to break out of the cycle by employing my ingenuity. And at that point, let's say I've deployed the ingenuity, whatever that faculty is, and then somehow I break out of the cycle. But as you're in the process of thinking, do you think could it be a tool, in other words, to hone your ideas or to potentially sort of break out of these cyclical patterns of thinking, or do you think it's totally useless?
I certainly think it can be a very useful tool.
Yeah.
I mean, for one thing, just to give an example, suppose I'm planning a new course.
Yeah.
And I think, well, how might I assess this? And I ask it to design a curriculum for me. It will come up with ideas gleaned from lots and lots of people over the internet who've been doing interesting things, a lot who, frankly, are much younger than I am and have novel ideas. And that can be really valuable. But my worry is that it generates an awful lot of slop.
Yeah,
and if people rely on it, particularly in the programming case, because what it's doing, it's undermining our inductive experience of judging people's competence.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
In the past, you could give people programming exercises like you with the for loop stuff, and if they could do it well, you could infer that they were pretty good at programming, and you could extrapolate that they would be good at solving related problems.
That's right.
But if somebody's basically produced their stuff with the aid of an LLM all the way through, maybe for years, they've given the impression of producing good code, but in fact, there's nothing there to extrapolate, because as soon as they go beyond the bounds of what they can get from the LLM, which will always be stuff that's already been solved out there, then they're useless. So I think it's very, very worrying from the point of view of the software engineering profession.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things I've been thinking about this a little bit, and this is a tough one. When I talk to people at these meetups, this is really a peculiar subset of humanity, and it seems to be about, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20% maybe 10% of the people that come, and these people are self-abstaining from LLMs, almost in a religious sense. They won't touch it because they actually have this feeling that there's an LLM contagion, and this LLM contagion is going to affect their ability to think and program. And in some sense, when these people come, it actually gives me hope for the future of humanity, because it turns out that maybe, there'll be this sort of subset of people who abstain and preserve whatever this sort of, preserve this Promethean fire of human creativity. And but maybe it's a case that 80 to 90% will be sort of, kind of rendered inert or whatever, and it will be satisfied with a sort of in-band thinking. But I just wonder whether there's some set of humanity that's restless and that will always be pushing for that sort of out-of-band thing, even if they have these tools available. And maybe that restless subset of humanity will sort of push us forward, even if most people are sort of, because I'll tell you the truth. Let's say I used Gemini to help me create some of these slides. And it was absolutely awful. I just said, listen, I'm going to be in Oxford tomorrow or whatever it is. I have to give this talk on, we have this, give me a slide deck. And it generated about 27 to 30 utterly unusable slides that were so verbose. It was unbelievable. And so this process of like paring down and like literally almost like a jungle, sort of taking a, and I just got fed up and I just sort of started from scratch. But in terms of just a raw idea generating device, it's great. But you're right. I don't know. Maybe in some sense we have to figure out how to interact with these things while preserving this fundamental creativity. And here's one thing, and maybe you can tell me this. I'm still trying to figure out the role of humans in this post-LLM world. Right, there's this funny thing where, despite the fact that chess engines are amazing, people are still playing chess. Even after that famous sort of AlphaGo moment, people are still playing Go. After the advent of LLMs, these machines that are nominally fluent in language and programming, is it the case that humans still have something to offer? Is it the case that we can still do creative ex nihilo thinking? Are humans around because we, maybe for survival reasons, we're able to do this kind of ex nihilo thinking? In other words, do you think, in other words, there's still sort of a role for us?
I happen to have played a lot of chess in my life.
Yeah.
But I would say with regard to chess,
yeah.
there's a massive difference between a chess engine and an LLM. LLMs are rubbish at chess because they're not storing any model of what's going on the chessboard.
That's true.
Now, with programming, the equivalent would be some engine that actually analyzes the code in depth, analyzes what's going on when the code is run, and gives you stuff that is provably correct.
Yeah.
If you had that, then a lot of programmers would be best using it. But an LLM is not going to do that. An LLM is going to give you boilerplate, which often the debugging of it will probably in many cases, take more time than the original writing of it would have done. That won't be true if you want to, put together a quick web page or a script for something on a web or something of which there are zillions of copies out there, of course. But I think it will be a tragedy if lots of young software engineers find it impossible to get jobs because companies are relying on LLMs to produce slop that may have all sorts of bugs in.
I mean, unfortunately, and again, this is where I think this is to a certain extent where the 10,000 hours come in. So both in engineers and then this friend of mine who's a lawyer, he says his law firm doesn't even bother hiring new grads anymore, and basically they have LLMs to do everything that a clerk would have done or some sort of junior. And so I wonder how that's going to play out in the long run. So let's say there's a class of people right now who have put in their 10,000 hours for whom maybe the LLMs are some sort of superpower. The younger generation is being cut out. And then what happens when these sort of older, senior engineers and lawyers retire? I don't know how.
But the case with law is completely different.
Hang on,
Yeah.
you've said quite a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Let's hear, I'm afraid I've been neglecting this side of the room. Yeah, several rows back, just in front of the screen.
Okay, thank you for the talk. Really interesting.
Yeah.
I had an AGI question.
Yeah.
So do you think that artificial general intelligence is a useful concept? And if so, how would you understand current capabilities relative to that? And if not, are there more useful ways to understand the trajectory that we're on?
I mean, it's useful for fundraising, right? So, those three syllables will raise like tens of billions of dollars or whatever. Yeah, it's interesting. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and he mentioned rightly so that Google's been doing a lot of work in terms of making LLMs more competent at math, and so in fact we have some new model that sort of it passes all these math Olympiad questions and whatever. And he mentioned that there's this interesting paradox where the LLMs can solve these PhD level questions, but then actually literally fail at 2 + 2, and how is that even possible? And so, if there is something, and so, there's this funny thing with LLMs where it seems like within a specific domain, it's possible to get something like, and I guess, by the way, SGI is the new AGI, is that super intelligence, whatever. But anyway, it seems as though it's possible to get superhuman intelligence in specific domains. And when you do have these incredibly large and expensive models, you do see some of these emergent properties that you won't get with these sort of small specialized models. However, practically speaking, especially when I speak to startups, nobody really uses these big, slow and expensive models for everything. Everybody seems to prefer these, like a constellation of small models that do one thing and do it well. And so I wonder if that's always going to be the case. In other words, I wonder whether AGI is a little bit overrated. I wonder whether having these huge models around, there are interesting sort of emergent properties. But I wonder whether, let's say for the sake of argument, after the AI bubble pops or whatever, I wonder whether the residual that's going to be left are sort of a bunch of interesting, specialized small models that you can compose to solve interesting problems. And I wonder whether AGI is part of the hype cycle. Anyway, that's I guess we'll see. But yeah, that's a great question.
Kerry, right at the front, please.
From the regulatory perspective, is there a response to LLMs that you would find meaningful in a positive way? Is that possible? Is that desired?
Well, what do you mean from a regulatory perspective?
So let's say the EU AI Act attempted something very broad and then generally had to tack on generative AI at the end.
Mm-hmm.
The US seems to be sort of eschewing it broadly. Canada's considering different approaches. Everyone seems to be trying to lump in regulation of generative AI with any other kind of AI, which is, let's say, difficult. But is there a response that were just aimed at LLM specifically that would be meaningful in any way positive?
Yeah. Oh God, you know what? So every time they, in order to speak in front of an audience, I have to do this media training. And one of the thou shalt nots is like, thou shalt not speak about policy for some reason. It's like, I don't know why it's so radioactive. I can't open my mouth. Unfortunately, I can't open my mouth. In principle, I think there should be, but oh God, I can't. They just won't let me elaborate. Sorry about that. But that's a wonderful question. I'm sorry about that.
Right at the back, please, on that side of the room. Yeah.
In your view, what kind of is like the end goal with this technology? And you said in like 5 to 10 years, like we might advance past this kind of like stalemate that we're at. But like, in your view, what are you kind of motivated towards? And this room is filled with consumers, and you had mentioned people abstaining from LLMs, but will there not reach a point where they don't really have a choice? Like we all were able to work and have relationships and go about our days without phones 25 years ago, and now I myself can't do that without my phone. So do we really have a say in kind of what is the end goal here?
Yeah, that's interesting. So and then, by the way, do you use LLMs? Like, do you interact with?
I use ChatGPT. And
you do. Like, how integrated is it into your life? Is it just sort of on the periphery, or do you ask it about relationships and food and
Well, I think that's what's interesting is we're kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, being encouraged to do that. We're being encouraged to use it, being encouraged to participate with it in kind of every facet of our work without really pausing to ask if that's good. And at what point are we kind of outsourcing ourselves to these models?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you the truth at Google. So we do this thing called perf. This is once or twice a year where we have to evaluate ourselves. And by the way, it's a really painful exercise. However, it's actually gotten better with LLM. I can now outsource my self-evaluation to the LLM, which means I never had this painful exercise of looking at myself. But on the other hand, it's a sloppy self-evaluation. so yeah, we're being encouraged to use these things, and what's a little bit disturbing is I don't know. There was this MIT study that came out a couple months ago, and they I think they gave some students a creative writing task and a programming task, and I want to say they divided them into 3 cohorts. I think there was pencil paper, there was Google, and there was LLMs. And the funny thing about these LLM people is that whatever artifact they produce at the end of this thing, they didn't remember any of it, and they didn't feel any ownership over it. Whereas the pencil and paper people, and in fact, I think they hooked these people up to fMRIs, and the pencil and paper people, neurologically, like their brains were sort of on fire, right? And when they finally produced these works, they felt ownership, and they more or less remembered everything that happened. And so that's one thing that disturbs me to a certain extent, and that's why I come back to that Plato thing where, he was, I think in the Theaetetus, he was disturbed a little bit by the advent of writing. But let's say for the sake of argument, we outsource all of our cognitive burden onto these models, and they're doing all of our writing, they're doing my self-evaluation. What does that mean? Does that mean I don't have any ownership over these artifacts anymore? Am I not really going to remember any of my work? God, it's possible.
But do you not think, like, I don't want to take up too much of the time, but there should be a greater kind of inclusiveness with us as consumers to kind of have a say in this? Because, again, to go back to the phone example, at one point in time, that was a great convenience that turned into a super reliant part of our lives. And, I think, yeah.
I mean, there's a funny thing about alcohol and cigarettes. They have these like carcinogen warnings or whatever, right? And I mean, do you need to put something on LLMs like, listen, the danger with this thing, you may not remember anything anymore, and you may not have any works. I mean, I don't know. It's God, because I mean, here's one of the other things too. So maybe just to let you know, kind of where things seem to be heading, and I sort of hate to talk about the future with these things, but there's this idea of these ambient models that are just sort of with you all the time. And just as an example, these, like, let's say things like glasses. And let's say the idea is you'll have these glasses, and you have this model that's constantly seeing what you see, it's hearing what you hear, and it's sort of always there, and just occasionally, maybe when you come across something interesting, maybe it interjects and says something. And it's this bizarre companion, and it's almost like the equivalent of if you ask the fish, like, how's the water, maybe the fish says, what's water. But in this case, if you have this, if let's say you were born with an ambient model that just followed you around your entire life, interjecting into your sort of daily business, or being there. I guess the question is, I mean, do you think that would change your life in a significant way? For better or for worse. But it seems to be that's at least, that's kind of the vision of maybe where things are going, are these ambient models. Is that dystopic? Is it utopic? I don't know. That's an interesting question. But yeah, it may be the case that at least with the phone, the funny thing about the phone is in theory, you have to sort of pull it out of your pocket or whatever with some intentionality. And if there's this ambient model that's sort of with you all the time, it seems even slightly different, right? It's even, it's a little bit weirder than the phone, Anyway, I don't know what that's going to look like. I guess we'll see. We'll find out.
Thank you.
We've got time for one more question, I think. If nobody else wants to ask, yeah, somebody who hasn't spoken before, right at the back in front of the cameras, yeah. Keep it fairly brief, if you wouldn't mind.
Parrots versus squirrels. Do I need to elaborate?
Oh, sorry, what's that?
Parrots versus squirrels.
Oh, parrots versus squirrels.
So if the LLM is like a parrot, has an uncanny ability to reproduce language, but demonstrably has no understanding of it at all, but is still quite entertaining for that. Perhaps the next breakthrough is more in squirrel-like behavior, because they have this ability to perform experiments, reflect upon the success of their attempts to do new things, and try new things, and go about matters in a more creative way. I tried to use Gemini CLI somewhat for programming. I'm back in the Claude Code camp now. I'm actually trying to add a sort of a Socratic layer to Claude Code to force it to reflect upon these outrageous claims it makes, like the code is production ready and all tested. None of it's true. So I'm just wondering what you think about reinforcement learning as the way forward.
So I guess here's a question. can you get squirrel-like behavior with parrots, right? So let's say, every time an LLM reasons about something, it's sort of like, I don't know what to call it. It's the appearance or the shine of reasoning, and it's a kind of pseudo reasoning, let's say. And in fact, when you have these thinking models, all it means is that they're just spending tokens behind the scenes, kind of engaging in parrot-like behavior. But I guess the question is, can you transmute parrots into squirrels in that sense, or do you just get slightly more intentional parrots? I mean,
CLI side of it.
Yeah.
It feels like the CLI side of it is actually performing a very valuable task in orchestrating these repeated cycles of LLM calls, and it's actually got some form of scope for quite meaningful reflection and realistic problem solving.
Interesting.
But as I've found that with Claude Code, it even though it's pretty good, it explodes after a certain number of lines of code. It just goes mad. It can't reason about what you're trying to do at all. Starts doing terrible things.
Right.
So there does need to be some form of additional agency and oversight
to
make it work.
And by the way, and I like the parrot-squirrel analogy, but maybe a squirrel is actually the best way to describe these agents then, right? That seem to have something like an intention, and maybe you're trying to solve a specific problem. And maybe in that sense you can promote parrots to squirrels. That's great, though. If you don't mind, me borrowing that, I love that. That's great.
Well, I'm afraid we're at time. My apologies to those of you who had questions and didn't get the opportunity to ask them. Before we kicked off, Peter and I had a little chat about what are we going to do if there are long silences and people can't think of anything to say. Fortunately, you did not confront us with that problem. Thank you very much for your participation, but thank you in particular to Peter for a candid and extremely stimulating talk.